On that sunny morning, the New York shopping mall was bustling with lights, shop windows, and hurried footsteps. Among the elegant crowd, a black woman walked with her 3 small children, balancing simple bags and the invisible weight of daily struggles. Her eyes reflected dignity, despite the modest clothing and worn shoes that betrayed the hardships of her life. She simply wanted a moment of peace, perhaps an ice cream treat for her children, a moment of joy to break the exhausting routine of working as a maid. But fate had prepared another scenario. A billionaire in an impeccable suit, surrounded by security guards, crossed their path. The encounter, which could have been banal, turned into a silent storm, fraught with humiliation, prejudice, and a wound that would never be forgotten. That moment, faced with mercilessly judgmental eyes, lit the flame of an inevitable karma, which would return to exact its price in due time. The words that came from his mouth were like blades. Sharpened by pride and arrogance, he called her unfit to be there, mocked her children, and made a point of raising his voice for everyone around to hear. Stifled laughter, knowing looks, and indifferent faces magnified the shame. The little ones, without fully understanding, felt the weight of the humiliation that fell upon their mother. Her heart aching, she swallowed every tear, needing to show strength. What no one imagined was that the invisible thread of fate was already beginning to move, and that this man, at the height of his power and fortune, had no idea that his own choices would trigger the coming ruin. Life does not forget. The universe watches in silence, and the return of what he sowed would be inevitable, with a taste of justice that would reveal itself at the most unexpected time. The mall was almost like a parallel universe to her, a distant world where the windows shone brighter than stars, and the hallways echoed with the hurried footsteps of people who seemed carefree. The woman walked with her 3 young children, each holding her hand or her clothes because the fear of getting lost outweighed their childlike curiosity. Their clothes were simple, well-kept, but they betrayed the hard life of those who work every day to survive. In her eyes was a mixture of weariness and hope, as if each step were a silent struggle to give them, even if only for a few minutes, the illusion of belonging to that world of abundance. The boys smiled as they saw the toys in the windows. The youngest girl pointed to a pink dress that seemed straight out of a fairy tale, and the mother, although she knew she couldn't buy any of it, let them dream, because dreams also nourish. She hadn't come here by chance. He'd saved up some money and promised his children that after a week of exhausting work in various houses, with their hands bruised from so much scrubbing, they would spend an afternoon differently. Maybe some ice cream, maybe a quick trip to the food court to share a simple snack. But for the children, this was already a big deal, like a prize. In their mother's eyes there was pride, not for what she had, but for the effort to never lack love, care, and the dignity of holding her head high. As she walked, she noticed the discreet glances that pierced her like invisible knives. Some well-dressed women looked her up and down, perhaps judging her modest clothing or hastily tied hair. Others looked away, as if pretending not to see. But there were also those who looked at her with absolute indifference, as if she were part of the landscape, invisible, irrelevant. Despite this, she walked on, her children laughing around her, trying to create a beautiful moment for them to remember. Fate, however, likes to play with time. It is precisely when the human heart opens to hope that the shadow of the unexpected appears. Thus, turning down one of the main corridors, she caught sight of a tall, impeccably dressed man surrounded by 2 security guards. The contrast was stark. His tailored suit shone with haute couture, the watch on his wrist more expensive than years of her labor. He walked with the confidence of someone who knows the world bows to his name. He was a well-known billionaire, one of those men the media loves to portray as a symbol of success. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief instant, the gears of fate clicked into place. The children, uncomprehending, looked curiously at this. Man surrounded by luxury. Their mother simply gripped her hands tighter, as if sensing something. He stared at her quickly, coldly, as if evaluating an object and then discarding it. There were still no words, but the air already held a strange tension, as if something bigger was about to happen. And it was in this seemingly casual encounter that the story began to unfold, because neither she nor her children knew that that moment would change everything, and that one man's pride would be the trigger for a deep wound that would echo for years. The hallways reflected light like blades on the marble floor, and the sound of the central fountain mingled the sweet smell of pretzels with the expensive perfume wafting behind hurried women. The woman squeezed her children's hands when the little one pointed to the coin carousel near the food court. She smiled sideways, promising that on her return she would let a coin spin to the center just to see them laugh. It was in this simple gesture, promising a moment of joy, that another presence imposed itself like a shadow. The man in the impeccable suit had appeared at the end of the hallway, talking quietly to someone on the phone, while two security guards cleared the way. The watch on his wrist caught the light like a beacon, and for a second the world seemed to bend under the glow of what he carried. A salesperson behind the counter straightened his back, a manager adjusted his badge, and the atmosphere shifted as if a cold draft were blowing through the air conditioning. The woman didn't want to cross his path, only to skirt around him, but chance, capricious, aligned steps. A store clerk hurried out with a transparent box when he lightly bumped into one of the boys. The box opened like a small accident of liquid glass, and colorful keychains scattered across the floor. The silence that followed carried the weight of a verdict. The clerk took a deep, tense breath, while eyes shot in from all sides, ready for a quick judgment. The mother bent down first, collecting the keychains one by one, apologizing for the mess, even though it wasn't her fault, and the children imitated the gesture. Their little hands hurried, the blush of embarrassment rising like a fever. The manager appeared with a clipboard, his eyes measuring every unimportant detail: the worn fabric of the blouse, the worn sole of the sneakers, the hastily tied hair. One of the security guards took 2 steps forward, not aggressive, just planned, as if following an invisible protocol. The billionaire watched with calculated disinterest, the call on his speakerphone talking about a merger, numbers, and deadlines, while his other hand rested in his jacket pocket. Someone behind him said, "Mr. Hale," and the name carried through the hallway like a password. He inclined his head slightly, a tiny gesture that, in the eyes of someone waiting for orders, sounded like authorization. The nearest security guard cleared his throat, offering assistance. That didn't feel like assistance, and placed himself between the woman and the hallway exit, a half step that was enough to turn a passage into a barrier. She thanked him without looking up, continuing to collect the keychains, returning them to the box with almost reverent care, as if that zeal could neutralize any suspicion before it arose. The little girl, uncomprehending, rested her head on her mother's leg and asked if they were going to get ice cream. "Let's go," her mother said, and those words had the firmness of an old promise. A bright sign overhead flashed over a donation drive for needy children. The contrast was almost cruel. The smiling face of a celebrity begging for compassion, while 2 meters below, the real world was already tilting toward another kind of spectacle. The manager, trying to sound kind, asked if everything was okay there, but the question came with an invisible comma that reeked of distrust. The cashier nodded, embarrassed, saying the accident was his, that no one there was to blame. Even so, protocol continued with the inertia of something that had already begun. The security guard asked for a second, just in case, and that was enough for a couple to stop by the window and pretend to look at watches, while in fact looking at what they thought they needed to see. The older boy stretched out protectively, as do those who too early understand the role of a shield. His mother touched his shoulder, urging calm with the touch only a mother possesses. The billionaire hung up unhurriedly, putting away the phone as if sealing an invisible contract, and finally took a step closer, just one, enough for everyone to settle back into his immediate area. His voice hadn't yet emerged, but the first nod established the hierarchy of the room. A nervous attendant offered water to you. No one offered anything to the woman who was still tucking the last keychain into the bottom of the cash register. A coin fell from the middle boy's pocket and rolled across the floor to the edge of the aisle, zigzagging between hurried feet until it came to a stubborn stop right in front of the billionaire's polished shoe. The boy ran to retrieve it. The security guard raised his hand in an automatic gesture of restraint. The mother held her breath for a microsecond, between the impulse to say, "It's just a coin," and the instinct not to raise her voice. In the reflection of the window, the woman saw herself and her children as silhouettes silhouetted by neon lights, and the image of the man in the suit behind them seemed to take up more space than her own body. It was as if the center of gravity of the mall had shifted, pulling the moment to a point of no return. There were no accusations yet, but their shadow was already there, cast by the measured steps, the measured glances, the breath that shortened before the blow. When she finally stood, the box returned, the gentle smile on her tired face. She realized that the promise of ice cream had been left hanging in the air like a musical note without a chord. And the instant the boy bent down to retrieve the coin lying next to his expensive shoe, the billionaire moved his foot forward, millimeter by millimeter, not enough to step on it, just enough to possess it. The gesture, tiny and calculated, was the first word of a sentence that had not yet been said. The silence that spread through the hallway was painfully dense. The boy bent down, hesitated before the expensive shoe, his fingers outstretched to reach the coin that was so little in the world, but so important to him, a symbol of a promised ice cream, of a moment of joy that could fit inside a small pocket. It was then that the voice emerged, deep, cold, imbued with an effortless superiority. "This is no place for that," the billionaire said, the short sentence piercing the space like a whip. The security guard straightened in one gesture, the manager lowered his head, and the attendant offering water smiled. Nervously, trying to hide her discomfort, the woman squeezed her daughter's hand tighter, as if she could shield her from an invisible storm. He tilted his gaze, not at the child, but at the mother. There was a mixture of contempt and impatience in his expression, as if the scene were a nuisance in his landscape of power. "Try to keep your children well behaved in places like this," he added, his intonation chosen so that everyone around could hear, so that every ear could absorb the sentence. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a public judgment, shrouded in sarcasm. The boy, confused, looked up at his mother, who bent down and gently picked up the coin, pocketing it as if it were a diamond. The billionaire smiled sideways, not a smile of kindness but of triumph, a triumph over someone who had never been at war with him. The children, not understanding the complexity of the attack, felt the heat of shame. The youngest hid her face in her mother's skirt. The eldest heaved his chest in indignation, but was restrained by that same pat on the shoulder that told him without words that fighting was not the way to go. And the mother, swallowing her wounded dignity, responded only with silence. But the silence in that moment hurt more than any response, because the void left by not fighting back was filled by the muffled laughter of two young men watching from afar, by the hard expressions of women crossing their arms, by the indifferent gaze of those passing by and pretending not to see. The billionaire took a half-step forward, as if closing a topic that never existed for him. But before stepping away, he leaned in just enough to drop another, even crueler sentence. "There are better places for you. This isn't one of them." Each word was a blade, cutting without drawing blood but leaving deep scars. The woman took a deep breath, keeping her face serene on the outside while her soul burned inside. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clutched the bag she carried. As if they were anchors, the people around them fell silent, but the silence wasn't one of solidarity, it was one of complicity. Prejudice doesn't need applause. Silence is enough to cement itself. The man turned his back, artificial security rearranging itself around him, and walked on as if he had simply removed an inconvenience from his path. To him, it was nothing more than an unimportant detail. To her, it was a burden her children would carry as a memory. The little ones didn't understand every word, but they felt the tone, the look, the contempt that seeped in like poison. The mother, with tears held back that dared not fall, raised her head, not to defy, but to protect what remained of her dignity. She knew that if she cried there in front of her children, the man would have completely won. So she took a deep breath, put the coin in her pocket, and walked with firm steps, as if the humiliation had been nothing. But inside her, a scream echoed, silent and intense, begging fate to deliver justice. The children followed her in silence, the ice cream forgotten, their joy evaporated. The eldest looked back, etching the man's face into his memory with the intensity of someone who would never forget. The mall corridor throbbed with its usual sounds again, but for that family nothing would ever be the same. And unbeknownst to anyone, the universe had already registered that moment, as if an invisible line had been drawn. It wasn't just a humiliation, it was the beginning of a countdown that would end at the exact point where his pride would turn to destruction. Karma, silent, was already on its way, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The food court was close, and the smell of fries and burgers seemed to mock them with every step. The children walked in silence, as if the laughter had been ripped from their throats. The youngest, who until recently had been asking for ice cream, now held tightly to the hem of his mother's skirt, his eyes downcast, as if he'd done something wrong. The middle child dragged his sneakers, kicking the air, trying to disguise his embarrassment with childish gestures. The oldest, however, kept his fists clenched, and his silence was the most painful, because it wasn't innocence, it was suppressed indignation. The mother noticed everything, every movement, every heavy breath, every hidden glance. She felt shattered into 1,000 pieces inside, but she kept lifting her face with the strength of someone who knows she can't allow defeat in front of her own children. She bought a single soda, dividing it into 3 small glasses. As the boys drank in silence, she watched their eyes, trying to understand what had happened. None of them asked, but they all knew. The wound was there, pulsing in every gesture. When the little girl asked quietly if they were still going to have the ice cream, the mother smiled with effort and said yes. But not that day. It was as if the words had been sewn together with iron thread, because each letter hurt their throats. She knew that for the children it wasn't just about the coin nor the ice cream. It was about something bigger, something they might not be able to explain now, but that would be etched forever. The feeling of not belonging, of being seen as less. At the next table, a white family laughed loudly, scattering shopping bags, colorful boxes, and new toys. The children at that table played with cars and dolls, while their father, wearing a shiny watch, cut slices of pizza. The contrast was stark, as if life had held a mirror before them to remind them how far removed they were from that reality. The eldest didn't take his eyes off the scene, and something grew in his chest that wasn't just sadness, it was a silent rage, a premature awareness that the world wasn't fair. His mother noticed his gaze and ran a hand through his hair, trying to erase the weight of that shadow. "You're better than this," she said in a whisper only he heard. But even. She wondered if she truly believed those words. The surrounding mall seemed to remain indifferent. Advertisements on giant screens displayed luxury items, smiling models showed off handbags that cost more than months of labor, and the aisles filled with laughter and conversations that had nothing to do with pain. For this woman, however, every sound became a hammer, pounding inside her head, reinforcing the memory of what had happened minutes before. She wanted to get up and leave, but she also wanted to prove to her children that they had a right to be there, that this space wasn't forbidden to them. She stood still, torn between pride and humiliation, between the desire to protect and the desire to disappear. The children didn't forget. The youngest, though uncomprehending, carried in her eyes the innocent question of why her mother looked sad. The middle son couldn't stop repeating the gesture of kicking the ground, as if he could drown out his shame. The eldest kept the scene like a photograph in his heart. He would never again look at men in suits with innocence. To him, the image of the billionaire would be the symbol of a cruel world, and this scar would shape part of who he would become. The mother stood, collected the empty glasses, and led the 3 of them out of the mall. There was no rush in her steps, but there was a weight. Every glance that met theirs seemed to carry a silent question, as if they were out of place. Outside, the cold wind hit her face like a slap, waking her up. She took a deep breath, feeling the pain tear at her insides, but held her head high. She needed to be strong. She needed to teach her children that their worth wasn't measured by a rich man's contempt, even if, inside, her heart screamed the opposite truth. That night, as she tucked them into bed, she watched each of them sleep. Their small hands clutched the sheets, their serene faces hiding the day's storm. Silent tears ran down her face, wetting the simple bedspread. She prayed softly, asking God to give her strength so her children wouldn't carry the mark of that day forever. But deep down, she knew that life has its own memory, and that moment would never be erased. Days passed, but the scene within them remained. Life seemed to return to its normal rhythm, with their mother leaving early to work in yet another house, where smiles were cold and orders were laden with superiority. But deep down, something had changed. The children's silence was different. The youngest, who used to ask for ice cream every time they passed the snack bar, now remained silent, as if afraid of wanting too much. The girl began to avoid asking about things in the display windows, and the oldest, who used to run to open the gate when his mother arrived, began to stare at the ground more, as if he were forcibly maturing. The incident at the mall had not been just an isolated moment, but an invisible crack that was beginning to spread through the walls of their childhood. The mother felt this weight every day. As she washed other people's dishes, folded other families' clothes, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, she remembered the look of contempt, the cold phrase that had fallen like a sentence. The billionaire's face came to her mind like an arrogant shadow following her, not because she was afraid of him, but because he represented all those who had tried her whole life to tell her she didn't belong. It was as if that scene had given voice to something that had always existed, but now echoed in every corner. What hurt wasn't just the humiliation, but the fact that her children had seen, felt, and breathed that poison right alongside her. The invisible repercussions manifested themselves in the details. At school, the boys avoided talking about their trip to the mall when their classmates commented on new toys or expensive snacks. The girl, when she drew, made simple dolls without princess dresses, and their mother, when she tried to smile at them, noticed that her smile became heavy as if made of iron. There was always the fear that the experience had planted within them the seed of shame for who they were. She prayed every night that they wouldn't grow up believing that man's words, that they would understand that their dignity was not lessened by their lack of money. But in the silence of the early morning, she feared it wouldn't be enough to erase the scars. In their neighborhood, stories spread quickly. A neighbor mentioned hearing about the scene at the mall, and the woman's heart sank. She didn't know if it was true or just made up, but the mere thought that others might know was suffocating. The episode had become an open wound, and the wound was always exposed, even when no one talked about it. It was a ghost that followed her in grocery lines, in bus lanes, in the eyes of strangers who might know nothing, but who, to her, seemed to carry judgment. Meanwhile, the billionaire's life went on as if nothing had happened. Newspapers featured his face in headlines of million-dollar deals, magazines featured lavish parties where he appeared surrounded by important people. To the world, he was a symbol of power. To her, he was merely a reminder that he had hurt her children without lifting a finger, with nothing more than words. But what he didn't know, and what no one there realized, is that life, however silent it may seem, never forgets. Every gesture has a return. Every humiliation sows something in time. The invisible repercussions were also happening on the other side, even if the billionaire himself didn't notice. Small signs of excessive arrogance were beginning to create fissures in his relationships with partners, employees, and even family members. He laughed it off, dismissing it as the foolishness of weaklings. But like cracks in thick glass, what seems small, sooner or later, shatters into shards. That night, after a hard day's work, the woman sat alone on the porch of her small house, watching her children sleep through a crack in the door. The silence of the street was interrupted only by the sound of a dog in the distance. Inside her, the scene from the mall replayed like a movie. And as the tears flowed, one certainty took hold. She wouldn't need to scream. She wouldn't need to seek revenge. She wouldn't even need to raise her voice. Fate would take care of the rest. Because the universe always returns, in due time, what was sown. Silence became a constant companion, but it wasn't a light silence. It was heavy, dense, laden with unsaid things. The woman woke every day before sunrise, got the children ready, made a simple coffee, and headed to the houses where she worked, never commenting on what had happened at the mall. She didn't want to further fuel the pain they already carried, nor to engrave in words what their eyes would never forget. But this silence spread, seeping into the way they looked at each other, the way they avoided talking about desires, as if asking for too much was always dangerous. To her neighbors, she was just another struggling mother, but inside, a war was raging. Every time she remembered the billionaire, every time she remembered his words, her soul burned with an inescapable rage. She would never see him arrested, never see him punished for destroying an innocent moment with her children. And perhaps that was what ate away at her most, the feeling that the world allowed people like that to live without consequence. She held this rage close to her chest like a bitter secret, like a stone in her heart. The children, without realizing it, learned this silence as well. The oldest began to respond less to the teasing at school, but not for lack of courage. He carried a burden no child should carry, the awareness that life is unequal. The middle child began to stay closer to his mother, as if to protect her from something invisible. And the youngest, still with the innocence of her young years, would ask why her mother sometimes cried softly at night. The answer was always a forced smile and "I was just tired." But the tiredness didn't just come from calloused hands. It came from a soul suffocated by not being able to scream. Meanwhile, the billionaire's life continued in a different silence, one of arrogance. At luxury dinners, he didn't notice how some partners were already avoiding eye contact. In meetings, his voice increasingly asserted itself as an order, leaving no room for dialogue. The silence of those around him wasn't respect. It was fear. It was calculation. It was convenience. But he mistook this for power. The more arrogant he became, the more he isolated himself without realizing it. The glass walls around him began to close in, and the echo of his own voice became the only thing he heard. In the small suburban house, the woman knelt every night, praying softly. She didn't ask for wealth. She didn't ask for luxury. She asked only that her children grow up, without bearing resentment. She prayed for strength so that the wound of humiliation wouldn't turn into hatred, because she knew that hatred corrodes the one who feels it more than the one who instigates it. But she also believed, deep in her faith, that time would bring justice. And this belief was her only weapon against the heavy silence that surrounded her. The children grew up under this invisible weight. Every time they passed an expensive shop window, they looked away. Every time they entered a place full of people in elegant clothes, they walked in silence as if asking permission to exist. Their mother noticed and suffered twice as much, but she couldn't change the past. All she could do was keep walking, keeping the pain inside, hoping that at some point the universe would respond. And the universe responded, albeit discreetly. Small bits of news about the billionaire's business dealings appeared in financial newspapers. Rumors of risky bets, miscalculated mergers, lawsuits that were beginning to drag on. He laughed it off, calling it rival envy. But the truth is that slowly and invisibly, the ground beneath his feet was beginning to crack. The same silence that weighed down her life was forming in his empire, only with a different face. The silence of someone waiting for the downfall. The twists of fate rarely come with warning. First, they appear as small, almost invisible cracks, which many ignore, believing time will make them disappear. The billionaire was no exception. Business newspapers began publishing discreet notes, an international negotiation that didn't go as planned, a partner who abandoned a project at the last minute, an ongoing lawsuit. To him, these were mere details, obstacles that any powerful man could circumvent with money and influence. He laughed off the rumors, calling them gossip, and continued his champagne-fueled parties and promises of even bigger deals. But what he didn't realize was that each detail was another thread pulling on the rope that held his empire together. Meanwhile, the woman continued her simple life, marked by hard work and nights of prayer. She didn't have cable TV, didn't follow business columns, but every now and then, in newspapers forgotten in the houses where she worked, she would see his face. The same face she carried in her most painful memories now appeared under headlines that spoke of debts, suspicions, a reputation under question. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply closed the newspaper, harboring in her heart the certainty that justice was beginning to move. The older children already understood the world's wounds better. The eldest, who had remembered the billionaire's face at the mall, recognized it one day on the cover of a magazine lying on the sidewalk. He picked it up, stared at it, and returned it with the same silence he'd learned to carry since that humiliating afternoon. He said nothing to his mother, but within him a strange sense of reparation arose, as if the universe were slowly returning the weight of the coin that was never just a coin. On the other side, his empire was slowly crumbling. Trusted partners drifted away, million-dollar deals suffered unexpected losses, and some who had once flattered him now muttered criticisms in the shadows. But his arrogance blinded him. He believed it was just a phase, that everything would soon return to normal. He continued to humiliate subordinates, treated secretaries as if invisible, and laughed loudly at dinner parties, as if he could drown out the signs of fate with his own sound. What he didn't realize was that he no longer walked among allies, but among predators waiting for the first fall to devour him. The twists and turns of fate never happen alone. They multiply, accelerate, and when least expected, what seemed solid turns to sand. In the silence of his luxurious mansion, surrounded by empty victories, he began to feel a strange loneliness. Many were there, but few truly were. The cold gaze of those around him was no longer respect, but calculation. For the woman, life was still hard, but there was something different about her journey. Not because she desired revenge, but because she was beginning to feel that her tears had not been in vain. Every night she had silently swallowed her pain, now became a kind of invisible shield, a silent force that held her steady. She didn't yet know how, but deep in her soul, she sensed fate had already set, everything in motion. And while she prayed in her modest home, asking only for strength for her children to carry on, across town, inside a luxurious glass and steel office, he received a call that would officially begin his downfall. $1 billion contract had been cancelled, and this time there was no phone call, no leverage, no money that could reverse it. It was only the beginning of the harvest. He could have interpreted those signs as warnings. He could have backed down, reconsidered his actions, sought humility. But no. The billionaire believed himself untouchable, as if the world were merely a stage created to display his power. Every missed meeting was treated as someone else's mistake, every lawsuit as persecution, every negative news story as a media invention. He never took responsibility, and the more problems piled up, the more his arrogance grew, as if pride were a wall capable of protecting him from the approaching truth. At lavish dinners, he spoke even louder, interrupting everyone at the table and laughing at others' nervousness. His security guards continued to surround him, but they no longer warded off respectful looks. They warded off looks of indifference and even contempt. Journalists, once fawning, began to write with a different tone, less reverent, more questioning. But he ignored them, buying advertising space and smiling on magazine covers as if everything were under control. His public image was his obsession, and while he maintained his impeccable facade, the interior of his empire was quietly crumbling. The depths of his arrogance were also evident in his dealings with others. Every employee, every driver, every server was treated as if they were invisible. If a dish took too long to arrive, he would humiliate the waiter in front of everyone. If a secretary made even the slightest mistake, he would yell at her as if she were incompetent. His gaze remained the same as when he had crushed that mother's dignity at the mall. Cold, calculated, designed to diminish, and without realizing it, he built a circle of resentment around himself. Everyone saw his downfall approaching, and some even expected it. Meanwhile, the woman lived the opposite, the humility of silence. Her days were the same, long and exhausting, but there was dignity in every effort. She continued to pray, continued to believe that her children's future would not be defined by a day of humiliation. But something inside her grew like a calm flame. The realization that life exacts its toll on every word spoken with cruelty, and that no one, no matter how powerful, can escape it forever. When she saw his face in the newspapers, surrounded by negative rumors, she simply closed her eyes and murmured a prayer, not of revenge but of surrender. On his side, his arrogance was already beginning to take its toll. Some partners demanded explanations, banks pressed deadlines, and market confidence began to crumble. Yet, instead of owning up to his mistakes, he blamed everyone around him. "Incompetent," he said, unaware that he was at the center of the disaster. And the more I denied it, the more fate tightened its grip. The abyss didn't open suddenly, but deepened with every step he took, fueled by his pride. The parties began to get quieter, the invitations dwindled. The same mall where he had humiliated his wife now featured his image in a magazine, not as an example of success, but as the target of dark speculation about bankruptcy. He tore off the cover in front of the employees, furious, but he knew he couldn't tear up reality. Pride still kept him upright, but his feet were no longer on solid ground. They were quicksand. And when, on yet another night, he raised his glass of wine before a small audience, laughing loudly to drown out the whispers of disbelief, he didn't realize he was toasting not to victory, but to the beginning of irreversible ruin. The fall didn't begin with a bang, but with a whisper that soon became a storm. The first major news story appeared on a business portal on a grey morning. The billionaire's main company had lost an international contract worth billions. At first, it seemed like just another market turbulence, something temporary. But within hours, shares plummeted. Investors withdrew their investments, and his name, once synonymous with power, began to appear associated with words like crisis, bankruptcy, and collapse. On the streets, LED screens displayed falling red graphs. And in the offices, murmurs grew. Those who had once been proud to be by his side now avoided saying his name. Headlines spread like wildfire. The billionaire tried to control the narrative, gave interviews, spoke with rehearsed confidence, but his eyes no longer conveyed the same strength. The world was beginning to see the cracks he had masked with arrogance for years. Within his companies, the atmosphere was chaotic. Employees were desperate, salaries were late, suppliers were knocking on his door. And yet his attitude remained unchanged. He called everyone incompetent, as if he could put out fires with insults. His arrogance now sounded like disguised desperation. The glass walls of his luxurious offices no longer reflected power, but fragility. Meanwhile, in a distant neighborhood, the woman who had once been humiliated watched the news on a television borrowed from a neighbor. His face on the newscasts was no longer that of an untouchable man. It was that of someone cornered, surrounded by debt and accusations. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She just sighed deeply, remembering the day her children were hurt by that man's words. It wasn't revenge she felt, but a strange sense of balance, as if the universe had finally settled its accounts. The children, now older, heard the rumors in the neighborhood, saw the newspapers on the way to school. The oldest recognized the name and immediately remembered the coin, the cold look, the phrase he never forgot. His heart pounded not with joy but with confirmation. The world could be cruel, but it also knew how to give back. The middle child asked his mother if he was that man from the mall. She simply replied with silence, knowing she didn't need to say anything else. And the little one, who still had a vague memory, leaned into her mother's lap, searching in her embrace for the meaning of it all. The billionaire's downfall accelerated. Corruption scandals came to light, political alliances fell apart, and even longtime friends abandoned him. Mansions began to be sold off in a hurry, luxury cars disappeared from his garage, and the circle of sycophants who had always surrounded him evaporated. Suddenly, he was alone at empty parties, toasting to no one. In the city's corridors, the news echoed, "He's lost everything." The man who had once trampled on a mother's dignity in front of her children now found himself reduced to silence, a silence that no longer represented power, but defeat. Karma, which seemed slow, had arrived with full force, and every penny lost was a reflection of the coin he had symbolically stolen from a child that day at the mall. Karma's return came not only in the form of debts or lawsuits, but in something far more devastating for a man who had always lived by his image: public contempt. That same face that once graced magazine covers as a symbol of triumph now appeared on screens as an example of decadence. Newspapers no longer spoke of success, but of bankruptcy. They spoke not of achievements, but of scandals. And what had once been flattery turned into mockery. On social media, people shared old videos of him flaunting his wealth, now captioned with cruel irony. The pride that had fueled his entire life was turning into fuel for humiliation. One night he tried to appear at a gala event, believing he still had some space. He entered through the main door, surrounded by cameras, but instead of applause, he heard only whispers. People who had previously revered him averted their eyes. Some laughed, others simply walked away. The feeling of being invisible struck him like a blade. It was the same look he had so often leveled at others, now returned, multiplied. He realized for the first time that nothing could buy respect when it had already been burned away by the fire of arrogance. In expensive restaurants, where he'd always had reserved tables, he began to be ignored. Waiters walked by without looking. Customers whispered and gave him dirty looks. Some even took secret photos, recording his decline to spread as a spectacle. This hurt more than any lawsuit because it struck at the very thing that had always been his greatest obsession, the validation of others. His empire crumbled before the city's eyes, and with it the mask that sustained it. Meanwhile, the woman continued her routine. She continued washing clothes, preparing meals, caring for the children. But within her, there was a strange peace. Not because she rejoiced in his downfall, but because she knew she hadn't had to lift a finger. Fate itself had taken charge of returning to the man the weight of the pain he had caused. The silence she had chosen to maintain, so often mistaken for weakness, now revealed itself as the most powerful response. The children were also following the events. The oldest, now almost a teenager, glanced at a headline on a classmate's phone. "Billionaire Hale faces bankruptcy." He smiled to himself, not with petty happiness, but with relief. It was as if an old wound was beginning to heal. The middle child, curious, asked if his mother thought it was fair. She simply said, "Life always gives back." And the little one, with what innocence she still had, hugged her mother and said she wanted to grow up without ever hurting anyone. The billionaire, increasingly isolated, began to feel the weight of closed doors. Business friends cut off contact. Former partners became sworn enemies. Even his own family distanced themselves, tired of the arrogance that now brought no benefits, only shame. The man who had once humiliated with cold words was now humiliated by the silence of the crowds. And this silence came not from reverence, but from indifference, the worst punishment for someone who had always thrived on attention. One rainy morning, as he left a building where he had attempted to negotiate a final contract, he was surrounded by journalists asking about debt and bankruptcy. He tried to raise his voice, but every word sounded weak, every gesture empty. One of the reporters mercilessly asked loudly, "And what would you say now to the people you've always treated as inferior?" For a moment, his gaze drifted off, as if the memory of that woman in the mall had flashed through his mind, but he didn't answer. He simply walked in silence, drenched in rain and shame. The return of karma had begun, and every humiliation he had scattered along the way now returned to haunt him twice over. There was no longer any bodyguard to protect him, no longer any fortune to shield him. All that remained was the weight of his own contempt, returned as an inevitable sentence. It was a cold afternoon in New York, the kind of day when the wind cuts like a blade and the sky seems to weigh down the city. The billionaire walked alone, without security, without photographers, without the aura of power that once accompanied him like an invisible entourage. He wore a worn overcoat, hastily purchased, after selling almost all his luxury goods. The shiny watch that had once symbolized his mastery of time was no longer on his wrist. He now seemed just another ordinary man in the bustling crowd, and perhaps that was what hurt him most, the indifference with which he went unnoticed. It was then that fate, ironic as ever, arranged their reunion. As he crossed the street toward a small market, he saw her. The same woman with firm steps was leaving with 2 shopping bags in her hands. Beside her, walked her 3 children, now older. The oldest already had the appearance of a teenager, the middle one seemed more confident, and the youngest, though older, still carried the same childish tenderness in her eyes. They were laughing at something simple, perhaps a sibling joke, perhaps just the relief of being together. His heart raced, not because he felt nostalgia or immediate remorse, but because the memory crashed over him like a thunderclap. Suddenly, he was back in the mall, in the bright hallway, in the coin he'd refused to let the child take, in the cold words spat before a silent audience. The woman's gaze from that afternoon, the silence charged with dignity, returned with crushing force. She recognized him too. For a second their eyes met. There was no anger in her gaze, but there was something even more devastating. There was memory. The silence between them stretched like an abyss. The children noticed the tension. The oldest, who had never forgotten his face, stopped and stared. The middle child, confused, looked to his mother for an answer, and the youngest, unable to grasp the depth of the moment, simply held her mother's hand tighter. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He tried to open his mouth, but his dry throat wouldn't let him. Inside, shame churned like a storm. It was the first time in all his downfall that he had seen the truest consequence of his actions. It wasn't the lost contracts. It wasn't the friends who abandoned him. It wasn't the houses sold. It was that silent gaze, that inevitable encounter, living proof that the past doesn't disappear. The woman stood erect, as always. There was no triumph in her posture, no mockery, only dignity. She walked past him with her children, without stopping, without a word, but in that simple gesture lay the greatest answer. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to accuse him. She didn't even need to remind him of what he had done. The memory was already consuming him inside. The billionaire stood motionless on the sidewalk, watching her walk away. His children's laughter, echoing in the cold air, sounded like a victory hymn. Not for him, but for her. Because despite the humiliation they'd endured, they were there together, firm, their dignity intact. He, on the other hand, was alone, reduced to silence. The reunion didn't bring confrontation, but it did bring something more devastating. It brought full awareness of karma. And, for the first time, he felt the true weight of loneliness. That night he returned to the small rented apartment that had replaced his marble mansion. The place was cold, with bare walls and borrowed furniture, with no trace of its former opulence. He sat in a chair that creaked with every movement and remained motionless, staring at his hands. The scene of their reunion wouldn't leave his mind. Her gaze pierced his memories like an invisible blade, and the laughter of his children echoed in his ears, like music he couldn't reach. For the first time there was no audience, no reporters, no sycophants to mask his shame. It was just him, alone, facing the unbearable weight of memory. The words he'd spoken at the mall came back one by one, repeating in his mind like a punishment. "This is no place for you. Keep your children well behaved." Phrases that at the time had seemed banal, spoken coldly to assert power, now felt like hammers to his conscience. They weren't just words, they were scars he himself had inflicted on an innocent family. And the cruelest part was that deep down, he knew they could never be erased. Across town, in the modest house where the woman lived with her children, the memory of that reunion also weighed heavily, not as a wound but as proof. She had seen his decline in his eyes, the emptiness in his expression, the defeat etched in every gesture, and silently she thanked God, not for seeing him destroyed, but for realizing that life had taken care of. Justice without her needing to sully herself with resentment. Her victory lay in her preserved dignity, in the strength of having weathered the years with her head held high and her children standing by her side. The boys commented on the man they saw. The oldest firmly stated that he would never forget what he had done, but that he now understood. Fate takes its toll on everyone. The middle one asked if they felt sorry for him. Their mother didn't answer immediately. She simply took a deep breath and said that the true sorrow is living surrounded by everything and, in the end, having nothing that truly matters. The little girl, not fully understanding, hugged her mother and said she wanted to grow up to be like her. strong, but without hatred. These words were a balm to the woman's heart, who realized that despite the pain of the past, she had managed to teach her children the most important thing, that dignity cannot be sold or lost in the face of arrogance. Now the billionaire, in the silence of his room, began to feel that the memory of that woman and her children would never leave him. It was like a broken mirror, reflecting pieces of who he had been. He remembered the coin he had moved with his shoe to prevent the child from taking it. A small, almost insignificant gesture, but now it became the symbol of his downfall. He realized it wasn't just arrogance, it was gratuitous cruelty, an act that had no purpose other than to debase. And realizing this too late was the worst punishment. As his wife walked on, with bags full of simple purchases and a lighter heart for having seen justice carried out without his hands, he sank under the weight of memory. Each laugh from her children became an echo that would haunt him for days and nights to come. He discovered bitterly that the true hell lay not in bankruptcy nor in loneliness, but in the memory of who we were before the eyes of the innocent. And this silent memory would be eternal. Time passed like a cold. Constant winter wind, and news about the billionaire stopped making headlines. His downfall was no longer news, and the city, always eager for scandal, had already chosen new targets. He, now forgotten, wandered the streets like a shadow of his former self. All that remained was the weight of his own name, which once opened doors and now closed hearts. He lived off small loans, favors that quickly ran out, and memories that haunted him night after night. His greatest fortune was no longer in his coffers, but in the ghosts he carried within. One grey morning, fate decided to cross their paths again. The woman, firm and serene, stood in front of the neighborhood church, helping with a food distribution for families in need. Beside her, her children, now teenagers, held out bags and smiled at those who arrived. The eldest organized lines, the middle one helped carry boxes, and the girl, now a young woman, delivered bread with contagious joy. They were images of dignity, seeds of kindness, planted in the same soil where pain had once germinated. It was into this scene that he appeared, shuffling his steps, his face weary and his eyes empty. He no longer wore suits, had no bodyguards, or carried expensive watches. Just an ordinary man, marked by ruin, searching for something he couldn't even explain. Seeing the scene, he felt a lump in his throat. That family, which he had once tried to crush with humiliation, now radiated a silent strength that made him feel even smaller. His gaze met hers again. There was no hatred in her eyes, no desire for revenge. There was only compassion, a silence that spoke louder than any words. She held out a bag of food, as she did to everyone else, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. He took it with trembling hands, unable to look up. It was the first time in his life that he lacked the power of words, only the weight of memory. The children watched the scene. The eldest, his heart scarred by the memory of the humiliation, felt anger. Stirring but looking at his mother, he understood the meaning of dignity. The middle child realized that the greatest victory was not to belittle, but to lift. And the girl smiled, a light smile that seemed to say that life is not measured by what we have, but by what we give. The billionaire, embarrassed, murmured a barely audible, "Thank you," as if the word were too heavy for his lips accustomed to commanding. She didn't respond. She simply nodded serenely and went back to handing out bags to others. That simple gesture, that silence filled with compassion, was more devastating than any revenge, because there he understood that true power lay not in wealth, but in dignity, not in humiliating, but in being able to forgive without needing to say anything. That afternoon he left the church carrying a bag of bread and rice, but what he really carried was the eternal burden of memory. He knew he would never regain what he had lost, and that the greatest punishment would be to live until his last day with the knowledge that he had been defeated not by enemies, not by rivals, but by his own arrogance. The woman, however, upon returning home with her children, felt at peace in her heart. She needed neither applause nor recognition. Her victory lay in her silence, in her preserved love, in the certainty that her children would grow strong, not because they had never known pain, but because they had learned that dignity can overcome any humiliation. Karma had served its purpose. And, in the end, what seemed like a story of humiliation had become a story of quiet redemption, where compassion overcame arrogance and silence spoke louder than any scream. And if this story touched you in any way, take a deep breath now and think. How many times have you seen fate silently return everything that seemed unfair? This reflection is a reminder that nothing goes unnoticed in God's eyes, and that dignity always prevails, even when the world tries to crush us. Therefore, I invite you to strengthen this chain of faith and justice. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any future stories. This way, each time you come back here, you'll have a space to be moved, reflect, and renew your strength.